The Kia EV9 is not just a big electric SUV. This is Kia's flagship here in Malaysia and in fact in a lot of markets across the globe. As a result, expectations are high with this car, not just because it is a big three-row family SUV that also happens to be electric, but also more importantly because the EV9 serves as the indicator of where this brand is going in its continual march up market. So, having just received the keys, we're here to tell you if this Kia EV9 well undercuts other 7-seater EV competition and if it's worth your 360 grand. My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the Kia EV9 6-seater. Now, before we get to the fun bits, let's first talk about the powertrain. So the Kia EV9 GT line in Malaysia is available only as an all-wheel drive model, which produces 385 PS and 700 Newton meters of torque. As a result, this car can rocket from dead to 100 kilometers an hour in just 5.3 seconds. Now, powering this is a 99.8 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery, which produces a WLTP range or provides a WLTP range of up to 505 kilometers. DC charging on this car is very impressive at up to 350 kilowatts, which means 10 to 80% can be achieved in just 24 minutes. Now, AC charging, however, is a little bit of a letdown because this car only takes up to 11 kilowatt AC, which means that a full charge from dead will take about 10.5 hours. Now, when you're not trying to charge up the battery, there's also a V2L system in this car, as we've seen before from other Korean marques, and that's enough to supply about 3.3 kilowatts, enough to take this car out for, say, a camping trip or so on. Now, beyond that, the Kia EV9 is, as I mentioned earlier, a flagship Kia product, which means that we get only the very best on this car as indicative of just what Kia can do. So up front, we get this massive bluff front end, obviously with no grille, as a result of this car being all electric. We also see a new interpretation of what they refer to as the digital tiger nose grille, where you can still see a visual pinch here in the middle. For what also, I'm not sure. Now, down here, we actually have illumination for the grille itself. This is actually a cost option in most markets, but they come as standard here in Malaysia, and they even come with a cool animation every time you lock and unlock the car. Next to those are a set of full LED headlights with this lovely pixel light design up here, which does remind me a little bit of a Cadillac Escalade. You also get these huge daytime running lights that stretch all the way from the fender down into the lower part of the bumper, which also double up as the indicators. Now, beyond that, you also have air breathers up front. This is to help cool the brakes, and you also have active aerodynamics at the front in either to improve the coefficient of drag or in order to improve cooling for the batteries themselves. Now, on top of that, I would also like to touch on the fact that this car is surprisingly practical. In addition to the cabin space in the back, there is also quite a bit of space up front because via the key, you can actually access the front boot. And because it's a double latch system, it means that I don't have to fiddle around for another buckle or a switch. I just lift up the bonnet. Now, the space in the front is not that big, I will admit, but it is big enough for, say, a briefcase, or more importantly, your charging cables, which means that they don't have to take up any space in the rear. And the fact that, again, it is accessible via the key, this is the first I've seen on a mass market car to do that, means that the space up front is actually a lot more usable on a day-to-day basis because you don't have to faff about looking for a button or a lever inside the car. Speaking of which, opening this from inside the car is also a two-press affair from a button, which means, again, you don't have to reach underneath the dashboard, you just press. Practical. Now, in other markets, there are a variety of different trims for the EV9, but in Malaysia, we get it exclusively as a GT line, which means that all of the body cladding that you see on the exterior is painted in a gloss color to match the body color of the car, which in this case is black. Now, beneath that, you will find a set of 21-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Continental Premium Contact C tires, which not only provide a degree of refinement, but also provide the performance necessary in order to keep this car stable. So that is nice and good. However, as we move further back, you will find perhaps the most controversial spec feature on this car, and that is the digital wing mirrors. Now, I'm generally not a fan of these because it reduces your depth perception as opposed to looking into a mirror, and it also kind of complicates trying to minimize your blind spot, but we'll get onto how these work a little bit later. Down the side, you also get flush door handles, as you'd expect from any modern car, which should retract if the car is locked, but so far we're having issues with this key. And so it sits nice and flush, and down the side you will see again the sheer size of this thing. Now, because the design language at Kia is aimed to minimize the amount of body sculpturing, you only get these sort of geometric patterns towards the rear and around the wheel arches, down the body line of the car, rather down the doors. It is relatively plain, broken up only by a little bit of contrasting plastic down there. Now, the roof rails in this car are functional, but honestly, the boot in this is so big, you are never going to need to put anything up there anyway. And as you can see, clearance might be a bit of an issue, so think twice before you try to fit a Tula up there. Now, I actually quite like the rear end design of the EV9 because I think these lights, for example, are very technical and they help to break up the monotony of metalwork back here. And the same can be said also for the lower bumper, which also has a little bit of that contrasting plastic that I mentioned earlier. Now, the EV9 badging and GT line badging, that's to be expected, but the Kia badge up here is absolutely massive. And I suppose no one's going to be mistaking this for anything else. Now, if you're wondering, there is actually a rear wiper, but it's tucked up here when it's not in use to leave this back end looking nice and clean, although clean is not the word I'd use to describe this car today. Now, opening this tailgate, which you can do hands-free via a proximity system, you will find a pretty good amount of space. Even with the third row up, as you can see, there is plenty of cargo room in here because this is ultimately a full-size SUV, as they refer to it in the States, which means that this is meant to be a practical space even when the third row is up. Now, if you need more space, the third row can actually be stowed via a set of buttons because they are adjustable electrically. And with that third row down, you have an absolutely cavernous amount of space, and if you're wondering, there is actually a tonneau cover that lives underneath the boot floor. Now, if you want even more space, the second row can also be folded completely flat, making this essentially a very large electric van. But overall, I think this is plenty practical enough, and even with the third row up, you should be able to put enough luggage back here for a weekend away. Other amenities back here include 12-volt sockets as well as a 3-pin plug, again as part of that V2L system, although you can also plug that into the charge port here on the side, which means that you do have an immense amount of practicality in this car no matter where you're seated or what you're trying to do, which is nice. I also appreciate the fact that even though the load lip is quite high, the overhang is quite short, so it is quite easy to take things in and out. It's just that the EV9 in Malaysia does not come with air suspension, which means this is the fixed load height. It doesn't get any lower, the car won't kneel in order to help you take things in and out, so you know, take that what you will. Also, the other thing about this car is this massive boot opens and closes very quickly, but it also opens quite high. You can adjust the opening height via the infotainment system, but you will need to pay attention when you're opening this for the first time after you bring it home because you might hit one of those. We didn't, but it got close. Now, as you'd expect from something this big, the inside of the EV9 is absolutely palatial. This car is massive, and in fact, sat in the driver's seat, I can't really reach even the furthest edges of the passenger seat. Now, dominating this interior is the screens, of which there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so going to the center screen, this is where the majority of the controls lie, and I will say that this screen is not only very pixel dense, but it's also very responsive, and this runs the very latest version of the Kia Hyundai infotainment system setup, and it is very easy to use. All the panels come very easily to hand, it's very easy to figure out where all your menus are and so on, so this is quite good. On top of that, there's also a set of shortcut buttons that live here on this panel, and they even come with haptic touch, which means that you even get confirmation when you press buttons. Now, there's also a physical volume rocker here, which is always nice to have, but if you're wondering where the HVAC controls are, they live here. Actually, no, they live here. So this digital panel here actually runs the majority of the HVAC controls, which means that you can control not only your temperature settings and your fan speed, and also the direction where the air blows to, but that also allows you to adjust the temperature settings. There are also toggle buttons here in order to change your fan speed and temperature controls, all very easy to find and very easy to locate should you want to make quick adjustments when you're on the move. But for the most part, I just set my temperature and leave it in automatic. Now, next to that is the instrument cluster, because this is also yet another digital screen, as we've seen before from Hyundai and Kia. While it's not the most customizable display on the planet, I will admit that it is quite easy to use, where all the information is displayed very easily. It's very easy for you to pick out what information you're looking for, like your consumption, your distance to empty, etc. And beyond that, you also have a heads-up display, which I didn't count earlier, which also shows you things like your blind spot information, your ADAS info, and so on, which is always nice to have. And now we move on to the slightly less conventional displays. Firstly, up here we have a digital rear view mirror, where you can actually swap between a physical mirror and a camera feed that comes via a camera that is fitted to the top of the car. This means that even if you have the car full up, you still have very good view out over the rear, so you have absolutely no excuse for not seeing a car behind you. However, you might need to keep that excuse handy because now we have digital wing mirrors. So Kia says that this helps to improve the overall drag coefficient of this car, and I've no doubt that that probably works. The trouble is that because this is a screen, you no longer have depth of field for you to understand where distance is, although Kia has gone some way to fix this, where when you indicate, it actually shows you kind of where the end of your car is and where a safe distance is for you to merge. On top of that, you also have the lane watch system that we've seen before from other Kia models displayed in the instrument cluster, which means that it does minimize that blind spot. This is most certainly something that you have to get used to. Now, the EV9 in Malaysia comes as standard with these. You cannot have physical mirrors outside, and so you have to try this for yourself to figure out if it's something you can live with, because if it isn't, then well, tough luck. Now, beyond that, we also have this multifunction steering wheel with all of the buttons that you need here, and they're all lovely and tactile, which is so nice to see after having driven quite a number of cars with digital buttons. Now, the ones on the left control things like your adaptive cruise control, etc., as well as manipulating the screen up ahead of you, whereas the ones on the right mostly control your infotainment functions. And you also get a couple of buttons down here which control your drive modes and terrain modes. As I mentioned earlier, this car is all-wheel drive, which means that if you want to take this car off-road, you could via these various different modes. I wouldn't suggest it if I were you, because this is still a 375,000 ringgit SUV, but at least you have drive modes here that control things like Eco, Normal, Sport, and My Drive, which is their version of an individual driving mode. Now, because this is a large SUV, naturally practicality is very well catered for. You have a relatively shallow bin here, which I'll explain in the back, but you also get a couple of deployable cup holders here, which you can close. You get a huge bin up front. You get a huge glove box here, which has a nice, interesting motion to it, as well as very large door bins big enough to fit a 1.5 litre size bottle. You get a couple of USB-C ports up front, as well as a 180 watt 12 volt socket. But more importantly, this USB-C port on the left can be used either for data transmission or just for charging, which you can change via a button down here. All well and good. Now, talking about these two front seats, these are not only electrically adjustable, which also come with the premium relaxion function should you want to lean back and take a nap. Obviously not while you're driving, but potentially while you're charging. You also get things like memory functionality for the driver's seat, as well as heating and ventilation. You also get massage functions for the driver's seat, which is not bad, but not the best. And more importantly, for this front seat, you also get Boss switches should you want to use this as a chauffeur car. Now, overall, this is all well and good, but I suspect that for the EV9, the bigger factor is what's going on in the back. Now, with the front seat set at my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have acres of knee room and a good amount of headroom despite the dual pane panoramic roof in this car. And life back here is pretty comfortable because these back seats are also electrically adjustable. You can push them fore and aft should you want to make more room for the third row, which we'll explore a little bit later, but you can also adjust the tilt angle. There is an ottoman back here as well, in addition to the ones over the front seats. You can adjust the recline angle, and you also have heating and ventilation. You also get another climate zone back here, which you can manipulate via the controls up here on the roof, with your own ceiling mounted air conditioning vents, which even come with a diffuse mode if you don't want air blowing directly to your face. Now, life back here is also improved by these privacy blinds, which also double up as UV blinds should you have two children sat back here. These seats naturally come with ISOFIX mount, so you can put a couple of bulky rear-facing child seats in here should you want to. And the point where they might make contact with the front seat is actually covered in a lovely fabric, which means that you won't get scuff marks on the plastic on the back of the seats. Now, in terms of practicality, I have these armrests here, but naturally there is no cup holder. Instead, the cup holders live up here. Additionally to that, you also get a tray, which you can deploy from here, so you can put stuff on that. And if you don't want that, you can actually push this tray back and reveal a large cubby hole. Now, this is part of the reason why the center armrest up front didn't have that much space, because all that space has been dedicated to this, and as a result, it means that you can hide lots of things in here. It's just a shame that that center cubby hole isn't heated, cooled, or ventilated in any way. That said, however, this isn't really the point of this car, because if I put this seat all the way to its furthest back position, as you can see, space back here is at a little bit of a premium, but I know that I can move these seats further ahead and then actually make a good amount of knee room available to me. On top of that, even though these are for occasional use, I will say that there is a pretty good amount of cushioning back here, which means even as an adult, I wouldn't mind being back here for maybe a couple of hours at most. I also have amenities like my own roof-mounted air conditioning vents. I get my own cup holders, a USB-C port, and the recline angle on this seat can actually be electrically adjustable if I want to get even more comfortable, although I do also have this light in my face. On top of that, these third row seats actually have their own ISOFIX mounts, which means you can even put child seats back here and they'll be able to enjoy the view out of these massive third windows, although in this car they're quite tinted. Now, it's quite clear that because this car is so large, it means that it is practical enough for very large families if you need to use all 3 rows of seats. But having a big car is one thing, driving a big car is another thing altogether. Now, the EV9 is available in Malaysia as a 6 and 7-seater, so it depends on how you want to configure those second row of seats. Now, the model that we have is the 6-seater, which is largely going to be purchased by people who have intentions to be chauffeur-driven in a car like this. And I will say that from the time that I spent in the back, given the fact that those rear seats are power adjustable with heating and ventilation, as well as the premium relaxion function that we first saw from the Kia Carnival, all of this adds up to an experience that I think is relatively positive. Compared to vehicles like the Carnival or even the Toyota Alphard and Vellfire, because this car is electric, it means that there is absolutely zero vibration from the powertrain. So movements, for example, like setting off and slowing down is just so much smoother and so much quieter. On top of that, we have remarked that Kias generally enjoy very good NVH levels in Malaysia, and the EV9 is no different. With acoustic glass available all the way around the car, it really does cut out the amount of sound intrusion that you get from other vehicles as well as wind noise. So all of that is quite positive. What surprised us actually is the refinement in terms of road noise. So even though this car runs on relatively high performance 21-inch tires, the amount of road noise ingress into the cabin is relatively minimal. As a result, you can drive this car at motorway speeds or even north of motorway speeds, and you still enjoy a good degree of refinement in here. So as a luxury car, the EV9 certainly stacks up. And again, it is worth pointing out that this is a 375,000 ringgit machine. It's not exactly crazy expensive like the EQS SUV from Mercedes-Benz or, in fact, the BMW X7. So as far as I'm concerned, in terms of value, this car really does put a pretty good word forward. Now, in terms of maneuverability, naturally the EV9 being a very large car does mean that it does take some getting used to, not at all aided by the fact that you now have digital rear view mirrors or digital cameras on the side in order to figure out the overall length of the car, which brings me on to something else, but I'll get to that a little bit later. I'd like to touch on dynamics first, because I think that with a Kia, there is this expectation that these cars will drive decently well, and I think that the EV9 certainly fits the bill. Now, make no mistake, this is a huge 3-row SUV, which means that it's not exactly going to be agile in any shape or form. Instead, what the EV9 offers is unflappable confidence. Because with this car's all-wheel drive system and again all that weight, low center of gravity, etc., the EV9 just enjoys a certain manner to the way it moves along. It manages the weight really, really well, and at no point does it ever feel uncomfortable in here. But while a lot of cars aim for comfort while sacrificing confidence behind the wheel, the EV9 does not. The way this car rides is again emblematic of just how much Hyundai and Kia have invested into ride and handling engineering, because at no point does this car feel like it's floaty. Of course, if you were to chuck it into a bend, you will very quickly discover just how heavy this car is, and the controls will inform you of that. But when you do take it through a bend, you will realize that there is a lot of mechanical grip here, and you will run out of talent long before the car does. So this is quite positive, and this does bode well if you're looking at the EV9 as something to do long distance travel in. I certainly wouldn't mind taking this over a long motorway journey, even at higher speed, because I know that the EV9 will take good care of me. However, when you are on the motorway, that's when you realize that these digital rear view mirrors do serve a pretty decent function. Because in addition to offering your mandatory rear view, as to be expected, they also have various functionalities to them. So for example, when you hit the indicator, not only do you still get your blind spot view in your instrument cluster, but you also get distance lines that appear on the digital screens in order to figure out sort of where the end of your car is and what a safe gap would be between you and the car that you're trying to cut off. This is, again, a good thing to have, because it then gives you a better idea and better understanding of just how big this car is and how much space it takes up on the road. So on the motorway, that's fine. But when you're driving in town and you're trying to figure out slightly closer distances, especially when you're trying to figure out if you might accidentally sideswipe a bike, that's when things get a little bit hairy. I have long had some degree of trepidation when it comes to these digital wing mirrors, simply because it removes a degree of depth of field perception from drivers. So because of that, it is a little bit more difficult to figure out just whether or not you can make those tight maneuvers, especially when you're driving about in town. And of course, because this car is enormous, you are going to be looking at those mirrors quite frequently, especially when you're doing lane changes and stuff like that, to figure out whether or not you can actually make that space. But the worst offense of all is when you're trying to park. Now, I'm pretty sure that the majority of our viewers will be able to understand when I say this, but when you're trying to park your car, you often use your mirrors in various different views in order to figure out whether or not your car is straight, if you're aligned properly, and more often than not, when you are trying to park, you will tend to move about a bit to sort of figure out where your wheels are in context of the parking space, etc. But in this, that doesn't work, because naturally this is a screen. You can lean forward and move your head as much as you'd like. The display remains the same. On top of that, while other cars offer a dipping rear view function when you're in reverse, even though it could be executable via software, this car doesn't offer it. Instead, it's the central rear view mirror that offers a slightly different view. It dips down just a little bit when you're reversing, but that's it. Aside from that, there is no other functionality to these mirrors. As a result, you will find yourself slightly more reliant on the 360-degree camera, which mercifully is very good, but it just takes away a degree of usability that a lot of people will be very used to while using conventional mirrors. But aside from the mirrors, which I think are a pretty decent gripe in my view, and being a Kia, the ADAS functionality in this car is absolutely excellent. So this car comes with your full level 2 semi-autonomy features, which include things like lane keep assist, lane centering, lane departure warning, adaptive cruise control with stop and go functionality, and so on and so forth. And as we've said in the past, Kia does offer one of the best and most polished systems within the mass market space. And driving this car through traffic is absolutely a dawdle, because you just turn on the adaptive cruise control and let the car do the work. And because this car is electric, that also means that, again, you don't have that sort of vibration and harshness as the car is moving about, which means that this is a very comfortable place to be. The EV9 does seem pretty flawless. At 375,000 ringgit, this car represents excellent value. You get great refinement, great range. Although this car claims 501 kilometers, in the real world we're doing about 450. And for those who use vehicles like these, for example, Carnival customers who use them currently to drive about in town and to do grocery runs or to be driven about into and from work, the EV9 is a very sensible upgrade for those customers. Because with electric mobility, when you drive about in town, you actually end up consuming even less power. And EVs love being stuck in traffic because that's when they use the least amount of power. Which means that if you're trying to be more efficient, especially more cost efficient, then an EV9 would make a lot of sense to replace a Carnival, or better yet, a Toyota Vellfire or Alphard, because I've no doubt that those fuel bills are pretty high. And compared to vehicles like the Mercedes-Benz EQS SUV and the BMW iX, the EV9 is significantly more affordable and you get more space. Even compared to the EQS, the third row in this car is much larger, and with the third row deployed, you still have a usable amount of space, which cannot be said of the Mercedes-Benz. Truly, driving about in this over the last few days has presented only a few issues as a result of the size, because this is a big car, which means that when you're trying to thread it through traffic in PJ the way I do, it's going to raise a few hairs from time to time. But if you're used to the size, or more importantly, if you are shopping for a car within this size category, then I don't think this is going to be a problem for you. And on top of that, beyond that size and the digital wing mirrors, this car is pretty much flawless. I have not yet found a single aspect of this car which I feel is a true sort of deal breaker. If you ask me, for under 400 grand, you would be hard pressed to find a vehicle that is more practical and versatile. More importantly, as a city car, an electric vehicle just makes a lot of sense, and as a big electric vehicle, at the moment, the EV9 is essentially peerless. It's not until we get, say, the electric equivalent of the Hyundai Palisade will we actually have a proper contender and competitor to this car. And I don't think that's coming anytime soon, so this is basically it. So would I recommend the Kia EV9? Absolutely. I think this car is incredibly well spec'd and offers excellent value. And if you're looking to upgrade or to move out of a large MPV that you've been chauffeured about in, or you do a lot of family duties in, then the EV9 should be a car that is on your radar. It offers so much for relatively little money. And because this is ultimately a Burmah's represented product, that means that you still get a 5-year warranty as well as an 8-year high voltage component warranty, ensuring that you do have full peace of mind when you drive this about. That said, however, I do understand that for those of you who may be buying within this segment, especially those who do a lot of distance, you may not really be swayed by an electric vehicle at this juncture. As such, Kia also offers the Carnival, which is also incredibly comfortable, and if you're doing a lot of miles, it's also massively efficient. That diesel powertrain remains cost efficient to run and use, even with the unsubsidized diesel prices that we deal with now. But of course, if you do not like Korean brands and you've generally purchased Japanese cars in the past, and you will most likely continue to buy a Toyota Vellfire or Alphard because you don't know any better. But honestly, if you take a second to really think about it, the EV9 makes a whole lot of sense. This is a car that's very easy to recommend, and once you get used to driving a car that's this big and that's this technologically capable, it becomes a cinch. I would recommend this very highly. In fact, if I had the money, I'd probably get one of these right now. I love the way this car looks, I appreciate the way this car drives, and while it might not be dynamic, that's not the point of a big SUV. What this car is supposed to do, it does very well, and for that, it is incredibly commendable. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2024 Kia EV9 GT line. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one, once the car stops protesting. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.